first thing I like to say before we even begin is there is a perceived notion that what we see from this viewpoint, our earthly viewpoint, is a predominant reality, you know, from which everything is judged, really. I think what would be really important if we reversed our thinking and took the opposite viewpoint, that everything which is non-physical is primary and what is physical is secondary. You know, so what this means is we think we have all the knowledge that we are living in the ultimate reality, and from our limited viewpoint we perceive the non-physical world, or let's call it the afterlife, as if it is something that is happening in some distance, you know. But in fact it's not like that. The reality is that we are secondary. The primary aspect of reality is actually the non-physical. And it starts off right at the top from where consciousness begins, let's say, if there is such a thing as a beginning, because there isn't really. Consciousness is. And everything that plays out plays a secondary role from the primary consciousness, and then it gets down into the billions of types of manifestations on different dimensional levels. And our physical level is only one of many, many other levels. And it's not even that important, really. It's just that we have chosen to play a part on this level in order to get a certain set of experiences. But this is not really our real life. You know, this is only a very small part of it. And it only contributes to our much greater life, which we enter into once we shed this physical body. So that's the first thing I like to say. If we reverse our thinking and not think of ourselves in this physical world as being of primary importance, it is only a small sidestep into another dimension which allows us to bring more experience into the field of our unity, into our consciousness, into the consciousness not just of ourselves but of us as a whole species, and even into the consciousness of the whole universe. So that's where I would like to start. The other thing I mentioned earlier, I was talking, we normally are concerned very often with people we have known who left this physical earth, and that's usually accompanied by a great level of hardship and bereavement and pain and anguish, because the feeling is once these people, our loved ones, our family have gone, we are sort of separated from them. There's just another one big illusion which is not actually the truth, because the truth is they're still here. Our physical senses are not able to perceive them, but they're still around us, they're still here. Now, from their point of view, they have never really left us, because what they are seeing, or can see anytime they choose to, they can see us, but they don't see us, they don't see our physical body, they communicate and see our astral body. Our astral body is basically a counterpart or a copy of our physical body. But on the astral level, it expresses itself much more formidably than it does on the physical level. For example, if we have any kind of pain, anguish or anything, then our exterior on the astral level will change accordingly. It does so on the physical level because we look sad and we look down. If we are sad or down or joyful, we look younger. Even on the physical level, if we are happy, we look younger. If we are unhappy, we tend to look older. But on the astral level, this is all much more exaggerated. So the people, our loved ones who are on the astral level, not only do they see us, but they also get the full gist of our feelings. they can tune into it, they get it instantaneously. Whereas here on this level, we have to say, okay, you look a bit sad, what's the matter? We have to talk about it. There we don't have to talk about it because we communicate it, and they can see it. They can tap into our thoughts and into our being. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that I was going to talk about a stage which is going a little bit beyond of what the normal, the normal aspect of the afterlife is. Basically, people are drawn to us because of our links we have with them, so they're always there, they're always aware of how we're feeling, so they can do their best to help us in terms of giving us love, and vice versa. We can also do the same thing, because on the astral level these things are very, very powerful forces. The Summerland is an aspect of the astral level, a part of the astral level, which is conditioned by feelings of goodwill, of positivity, of love. And the way these feelings express themselves, or the way they establish the environment, is in terms of beautiful scenery, beautiful nature, harmony, beautiful sounds, everything what people would normally describe as a heavenly situation. And the Summerland is basically a reflection of this, and is a Summerland because it is like perpetual summer. Everything is in blossom, everything is beautiful. There's a harmony in existence where people vibrating on the same wavelengths, with the same interests, are drawing other people towards themselves, who have got similar interests and who are attracted to each other. So you get into a state of consciousness which is characterized as a state of heaven, and very often when people get into this state, very frequently people have near-death experiences. They are catapulted very often into these higher regions where they have these sort of kind of experiences. Now, but this is very often as far as our human consciousness goes. There's very little has been written about what is there anything beyond that. If you're already very, very happy and very in a beautiful sort of state of mind and surrounding, is there anything more than that? And that's what I wanted to hint at, because I think that is also, if there's another book, but I'm starting to make reports from my experiences. If there's going to be another book in the next 5 or 10 years, it will be touching on the aspect of what is beyond this sort of state of consciousness, which is very familiar to most of us. And this is something which I touched on when I wrote my second book, which was The 10-Minute Moment. In 2013, I went into a retreat in the Scottish mountains for a week, in a solitary retreat in a little bit like a sort of like a cabin. And then I kept a diary, and I wrote down everything I experienced. Whereas before, in Multidimensional Man, I wrote down what I experienced during my out-of-body experiences. In 2013, I wrote down everything that happened during the day and during my meditation, because every moment of my 7-day retreat was a meditation. Whether I was awake or in meditation, it was a total connection to the present moment. And that is a key thing. If you connect to the present moment reality, you supersede any content that is going on within your emotions, in your mind, in your thoughts. You are connecting to a reality which is the basis of life, basically. And you can do that by focusing on a state which is like just a being, or the awareness of being alive. So I started getting up very early in the morning at about 4 or 5 o'clock. I started meditating for a couple of hours. Then I had breakfast, and when I had breakfast I was very mindfully eating, being very aware and trying to be connected to the present moment without being overruled by thoughts or by thinking, and just getting into this. But of course thoughts come up during these processes, also during meditation. So you become mindfully aware of the thoughts, and that in itself is another meditation. So eventually, after a few days, these sort of things intensified, and I became more and more aware, and also at the same time I became very aware of nature. I connected to nature in a very profound way. For example, the first thing I noticed, there was a squirrel nearby. It would never really come and show itself. And I took my camera along, and the first thing I noticed was I wanted to take a picture, and as soon as I had the camera, the first photograph of the squirrel was of its tail, because it immediately took off. So gradually I found that as the more I got into this meditative state, the more nature, the squirrel, responded in a positive way, and the birds came to the veranda, and I put out seeds and they started eating. They even started getting into the cabin, and the squirrel also was it started posing in the end when I tried to take pictures, like some sort of model. So there was a harmony established between myself and the external world, and then one day the squirrel brought his friend along, so I had two squirrels, and the birds were always around me, and then when I went into the surrounding countryside, I could see there was a unity between all the living things, the forest, the grass and the moss and the fallen trees. It was all one big organic situation where everything was in harmony. And I could, even then, when I focused my attention, I could see through the moss. I could see how the moss got its energy from the ground, and how the ground was connected to other plants. And I could just perceive everything as a holistic thing. And then finally, after it was about the 5th day, I went into a very deep meditation, and then I suddenly lost all sense of self. And that was, for the first time, I noticed I was at the door or a big barrier in front of me, and beyond this barrier there was something which was so tremendously awesome that I became really afraid. I thought, if I go one step further, I die. I don't just physically die, I die spiritually. There will be nothing left of me. And this, suddenly I found that if I go one step further, there can only be one thing, and that is God. But that wasn't a comforting thought. To me, that was a very, very frightening thought, because that meant the total destruction of who I was, and I would probably be burned to a cinder if I went this step further. So I immediately took flight. I went out, I went for a walk. I tried to find the comfort of my ego. I tried to find anything which I could connect to my ego identity, and bring some sense of self back into my reality. And I was just not prepared to go the final step. So it took me a few hours and I used the camera to focus on things, to take pictures. So I had a role or an identity as a photographer. I was desperately trying to rebuild an identity. And then I was quite exhausted at the end of the day, and I went to sleep. But in the night, all the horrors which I was, the anticipation of this incredibly overwhelming event, that sort of subsided. I had very, very beautiful dreams, and all the stress or the fear was sort of gradually taken away from me. And then the next day, the next morning, I woke up and I meditated, and I was sitting on the veranda of my little cabin, and I was looking into the outside world, and I sort of saw the grass, how the sun was playing with the grass blades, and there was a light on nature, and I thought, oh, how beautiful, how the sun, shines on everything, and how it makes it sparkle. But then I found that this was not actually what was taking place. What I was seeing was there was an inner light in everything I looked at, that the light reflected was not really a reflection, it was an inner energy which I could see. And gradually, everywhere I looked, I could see everything was made out of light, and it was radiating from the inside. And as I looked closer and closer, the whole world around me was ignited, and I could look down on my legs, and my whole body turned into energy and light, and suddenly I had this incredible experience, which I since then tried to put into words, but I just couldn't, because it was so overwhelming. The only thing I could say about it was that I remembered. It was a recall of what I really was. It was a recall of what reality was at the base level, and everything made sense. But before that happened, or at the same time this happened, I also had I went through an intensive suffering. And as I suffered, I noticed that I was aware of the suffering of every living creature, every living being, every animal, every human being. And the next moment it tipped over, I was aware of the joy of every living being, every animal, every human being. And then after that, I had this incredible state of clarity, And I had this state twice before in my life, but the first time was in 1972 when I was meditating, and that first experience triggered my out-of-body experiences. The first experience was that I realized I was not the body, that I was not tied to the body, and as a result of this intensive first experience, I was able to leave my body. The second experience of this intensity, of this inner light or this clarity, came in 1980 as I was having an out-of-body experience, and I was hooking up with my inner guide during the out-of-body experience, who had trained me beforehand, and he took me into the clear light, which I also documented in the Multidimensional Man in this book. You can read it up. And then this one, which came about nearly 40 years later, that was the third experience, but this time I couldn't find my way back. I lost the sort of identification with this persona I had before, this to the extent that I couldn't even remember who I was yesterday or what I did yesterday. There was no link to any personality as such. There was no connection. So from that moment on, I lived very intensely in the present moment. So that didn't go away, and I started writing the 10-minute moment about 6 months later, and even after 6 months, this state hadn't left me. It was still there. And then I realized it was not only there, but it intensified. So then, of course, I had in the meantime, since 2008 and 2015, I had a series of intensive out-of-body experiences and higher spiritual experiences, which I then documented in this second out-of-body book, which is Vistas of Infinity, which goes into quite a lot of depths. And I also used little black and white images in front of each chapter, where I try to depict what these inner landscapes look like when you go into an even higher state of consciousness. So when I said beyond the Summerland, it is this aspect I would like to talk a little bit more about, because this is actually the state where we naturally belong, every one of us. This is the base level of our being, the base level of our reality. And this is where we already are, where we're residing in, except we are distracted. We are distracted by thoughts, by needs, by desires. They take the focus away from this reality of our being. But the beautiful thing is that we're all heavenly creatures, if you like. We are already living in a state of unity. The only difference is that we are not aware of it, or we are not focused on it, And very often it is said when people say, how do you reach sort of awakening? You can't reach it. It is just like a recall, remembering it, But we're already there. And that's why I find it so important to talk about these states. Now, accompanying these states of higher consciousness, of course, are the infinite levels of inner worlds we can visit. Some of these experiences which come when we enter into the state, and just a brief description what it feels like. Once the ego identification is gone, you feel you are, let's say the ego identification, our personal identification, if you link it or picture it like a cup, okay, that's where we are inside the cup, and that's what we are. But when we get into the awakening state, we are still the cup, but we are also this thing, the surrounding that holds the cup. So we are no longer limited to this cup, and we then transcend the limitations of our physical experience, and we broaden our identity and our sense of self into a universal sort of sense. And the first thing that happens is we no longer perceive an outside world. Before we have seen, okay, this is me and there's a world outside. This is me and there are other people, they're all strangers. This concept just falls apart. It doesn't exist anymore, because we suddenly become aware of a much greater sense of ourselves. At the same time, we also recognize that the people we meet, we don't recognize them as strangers anymore. We're more likely to pick up on their inner divinity, even if they're angry, we very often perceive that as a mask or as an irritation or something they were temporarily engaged in. But we tend to look a little bit beyond that, So now the other thing that happened since 2013, which is now 6 years ago, I noticed that life doesn't just sort of carry on the way it was. The thing that started happening after 2013, that I entered a state of consciousness which can best be described as a permanent stillness, as a permanent peace, that the ground level of being alive is one of utter peace and stillness and tranquility. And that was a state I could build on and could rely on. That doesn't mean you're immune to emotion or to physical aspects, because they belong to another energy body which we all carry around. So it doesn't mean we are not susceptible to pain, physical pain or emotional pain. You know, that doesn't mean that, but be underneath this pain, underneath this emotion, is a stillness, you know, which is a base level. And then a couple of years ago, I went with a friend of mine on a kind of pilgrimage through Greece. We were going to visit all these sacred sites in Greece, like the Acropolis, Delphi, which we missed, but then we ended up in a monastery on Mount Athos, where we met some incredible monks. And I mean, I'm not a Christian, and I couldn't lie. I said I'm not aligned to any religion, so I was quite straightforward when I filled in the application form that I put down non-religious. And then when we arrived at the monastery, we didn't get anywhere to stay, because for some reason you needed to adhere to some sort of Christian belief system. I think that was the reason, but we went to the monastery and we had nowhere to stay. And so we met a monk there, and everything that happened on this trip was total synchronicity, total, almost as if once we set foot on it, the first monk we met, we asked, where can we possibly find anywhere to stay? He said, oh, well, just leave it with God. He will provide. And sure enough, everything that happened from then on was very synchronistic, and we always found a place to stay. There was always a cell. Sometimes the monks came to us as we approached the monastery and said, come, we have got a room for you. So this happened, and then I met a monk from London originally, who had been a Buddhist, and we immediately had a rapport, and we were talking about meditation and things for a whole day. And then at 4 o'clock we went to the service, the church service, which was 4 hours long, which was quite an intense meditation. Then there was food. Then in the afternoon there was another 4-hour prayer session. And so we went with it, and in between we talked about the Orthodox monks' belief system and so on. And then, without going into much detail, I had a very profound spiritual experience, which will have to wait until later because it's got to be connected. I had a very profound spiritual experience where I discovered a new dimension to the stillness, and the new dimension was love. So from then on, not only did I have this incredible stillness, but also it was punctuated with a stream of love which I could feel when I looked at things. And then it dawned on me that the base level of reality is not just stillness and love, but is actually bliss. So when we leave all our identification behind, we live on a base level of reality which can only be described as blissful. Now the blissfulness of reality that starts appearing the moment we wake up in the morning, it's a bit like ocean waves. You know, they rise and they die down, and when they go flat, you still have stillness, but then the slightest movement sort of brings the bliss aspect of the stillness to the foreground. And then, of course, this also has got brings forth other aspects in the awareness. For example, when before, during out-of-body experiences, I went to the Summerland, you know, now the new level of reality was actually something which I would call the true heaven state. That is where you no longer have an identification which is limited to your personal sphere, but you simply enter into a completely new domain, into a completely new state of consciousness, which has, when you have an out-of-body experience, it is not the same you would have before, where you're sort of separated from your body. It's basically that you become aware, and when I closed my eyes, I could, first of all, I could see new territories emerging in front of my vision, new landscapes, and I could see them very clearly, first as a vision, and then gradually they solidified, and at that point you simply surrender. And that is also a meditation technique, which I'm going to elaborate on. You surrender to this, and then it is almost like if you put on a virtual reality headset. Suddenly it becomes your immediate environment. It doesn't matter where you are. And at one particular point, I was sitting on a bench in the middle of the town with the street noise around me. And the first thing I noticed, the street noise soon became like a sound tapestry. It was no longer cars and people chatting. It was more like a sound background. And around me, I visualized, first of all, this beautiful heavenly landscape, which I'm going to illustrate at some point. And then I suddenly literally sat in this landscape. And as I closed my eyes and looked down, I could see the ground, I could see the colors, merging around. And so you can eventually, when this awakening solidifies, you can actually live life on multiple dimensional levels at the same time. So you can live in this world, but you can also live a parallel life, which is not tied or limited to this world. Well, the thing is, the ego self is actually not very efficient in terms of functioning. I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, that the primary state of our functioning as a human being is a spiritual state. Okay, and instead of functioning on the level of emotion, thoughts, ideas, we function on what I call the wisdom level, which is an automatic functioning, which doesn't require much thinking. You simply do. You become an instrument of a greater awareness, if you like, and this awareness has got a much greater comprehensive view, So you don't function artificially. You don't sort of think about things. Oh, what did he say? How should I respond? Oh, this person insulted me. What shall I do now? That simply doesn't wash anymore. If somebody, for example, throws an insult at you, the instinctive thing is to look over your shoulder, wondering who was meant by the insult, because you can't relate to any insult, because that thing that is sort of being insulted is no longer a reality. So this insult flies over your shoulder. So you don't respond in a traditional way that you activate your vanity, let's say, or your self-importance. You just act naturally, and so it makes the life a lot simpler. And the same with buying food. You're just buying food. You work. I'm still working as a commercial illustrator. That doesn't interfere with anything. I talk to my clients, and I talk to my agent, and there's no interference, because you don't have to operate on the ego identification level. If anything, there is a distraction, so you can function much more effectively if you leave this idea of self out. We are giving priority to things in our daily life which aren't real. You know, we're living a life of pretenses. We have got goals which make us more important, which is basically make our ego more important, which is in itself a figment or a psychological construct. It's not even real. But we have built this reality around an identification which we artificially created in the absence of our true identity, which is our universal self, our spiritual self. And this causes most of the problems we're going through. And it doesn't matter really whatever we look at, whether it's war, whether it's politics, you know, and all these things. It's just mainly based on a wrongful identification with something we are not. And out of this, of course, come all sorts of injustices and wars and suffering and things like that. After I had the first intensive awakening experience when I was, which was in 1972, from then on my life had completely changed, because I realized that I wasn't limited to this physical body, and then the out-of-body experiences started to happen. But something else happened which was very, very significant, and that was the acquisition of a silent companion. I called it a silent companion. There was an aspect of awareness which felt as if something or somebody was always walking beside me, you know. And I always called it my silent companion. It was an awareness of a greater intelligence, a greater awareness, which knew everything and which I could relate to, and it was also the guiding force in my life. So whenever I had a question, I would pose this question, and I wouldn't get an answer in terms of words or a sensical answer. I would just get back silence. And the silence wouldn't actually tell me anything. It was, I used the silence to find the answers through the silence. And the thing was, whenever something happened in my life which was incongruous or which was selfish or mean on my part, the moment something like that set in, or I was aggressive for some unknown reason, then that moment the silent companion disappeared. I was on my own. I was totally left on my own. So I immediately saw this as a teaching aspect in my life. So I became very aware of how to act towards people, how to behave. So the moment I was my behavior was incongruous, the silent companion would disappear. And the moment I sort of surrendered this sort of self-centered or selfish aspect, the silent companion would return into my life. So I always regarded that as my guide, as my teacher. And that materialized during my out-of-body experiences, sometimes as an actual guide, you know, in various forms. So yeah, so that was the spiritual teaching carried on during the out-of-body experience, when I had various guides. In one, I described them in Vistas of Infinity, how they sort of made an appearance. In one case, came like a tramp into my life. In another experience, it was like a sort of rather jovial character. His name was Phil. And so there was this interaction taking place, which I always documented in both of my books, how they appeared. And they helped me to, on my spiritual journey, if you like. That was an interesting aspect which I explored in my books as well. The ability to change your form and to manifest different forms. I first became aware of it, which I documented in my first book. There were sort of carnival processions. People really like celebrating on the astral level. almost as if they have nothing better to do, and they probably don't have anything better to do. So they have a massive amount of entertainment, celebrations, and on a couple of occasions I saw which was like a carnival procession. But if you see pictures of the Rio Carnival, there are some amazing costumes, But here the people just transformed themselves into half animals, half human, and put on the most amazing appearances, Some people were transparent, others had the most amazing forms, and it was just an awe-inspiring experience. Another time I went into, which I thought was an art show, an art exhibition, because I'm an artist. And there again, there were people transforming their appearances to the most outrageous sort of personal things they could muster. This has cropped up again and again during several experiences, and also one person transformed herself as a dragon, was a woman who came then appeared to me as a dragon, which I described in Vistas of Infinity. And so these things are quite easily accomplished, especially if you put your heart into it and your soul and your emotion into it. And then the imagination, driven by the emotional energy, and actually accomplishes these amazing transformations. Also, on a minor scale, I noticed after my mother died, she appeared to me in the most amazing disguises. One time she appeared to me with my aunt as sort of 17-year-old teenagers in the most outrageous current fashion, and I didn't recognize her. I only recognized her when she hugged me, because the hug was unmistakable. It was my mother, and they obviously had fun misleading me like this. But of course, to me, it was a sign how liberated she had become after she had died, because my mother, before she died, she went through a period of deep depression. And the first time in her afterlife, she was still in this cocoon. She was like in a big shroud, and I couldn't reach her, And then later, I also documented in my book, I finally met her the way I remembered her. And since then, I met her on many, many occasions, and nearly every time she would, pose herself in a different outfit or in different disguise. So yes, that's one of the most intriguing things I discovered, and the most enjoyable things. I did actually ask people how they accomplish these magic feats, and I was really bad at it. There was one instance which I document in my book where I met a group of people in the sitting room, and we had a chat, and I asked her, how do you, they were having tea, and I said, how do you do that? How do you make a cup of tea? Suddenly you all have a cup of tea. How do you do that? And she said, well, you just have to put, your feeling into it and your imagination. And I tried to replicate it, but I was very bad. I created like the first day at the pottery class, a very, very bad pot, and it had gaps, and I tried to put it together with my fingers, and then there was a pattern emerge, which came out of my memory from something else, and then I thought, okay, all I need now is tea. And when I started drinking the tea, it was just like water, and I noticed, and they were, of course, laughing about me, and I noticed the thing which people learn is they have to learn it from the inside out. They have to feel it, they have to become one with it. So it's not even an effort anymore. It is a natural manifestation. And in my first book, in the appendix, I wrote all the different ways of how to manifest things, the different methods used, how things come about. Sometimes they come about simply by an act of expectation. If you suddenly expect something, it's there. you know, it's as simple as that, or by a strong desire or a strong need, you know. So on the astral level, we manifest things also on a subconscious level, you know, which is very interesting, because let's say you're walking along in a park and suddenly there are trees all around you, and you stop at a tree and you admire the beautiful garden, and suddenly right next to you a blossom springs up, and the blossom sort of reflects your feeling of your enjoyment, and suddenly pong, 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 all these blossoms spring up around you simply because you put this feeling out. So you get into a state of synchronicity with your surrounding. It changes quite naturally. Of course, the opposite happens as well. If you are in a negative state of mind, people who are in a very, very negative, mean state of mind, they manifest the absolute opposite, you know. If they are, and I spent quite a lot of study time on the very dark levels to see what actually people create, and it's quite sinister. You know, I always find this is probably the area. If somebody wants to, you know, direct a horror movie, this is the area they dive into, and they bring all this stuff out in the open, you know, which is all fear-based, you know. Mm-hmm. So yes, we have got incredible creative powers in the positive as well in the negative sense. Yes, people, that is a natural state of progression. What happens on the lower levels, which are called the near-Earth levels, you know, which are basically exactly like this physical world. You wouldn't know the difference if you are on these near-Earth levels. The thing I noticed, some people were sort of plagued by boredom, okay? And when this boredom or dissatisfaction sets in, that is usually the beginning that there's an awakening for something, for a need, something more. And this sort of attracts other people to them, which are sort of in congruence with them, you know, in sympathy with them. So they gradually shift their environment, shift their needs, the same as we do here. You know, suddenly we come to a point in our life where we are dissatisfied with our jobs and we want to change the job. These needs still persist, and then people want to have more. The good thing is the opportunity for learning is much, much more enhanced, you know, because also the thing is, it's almost like we are leaving a straitjacket behind when we slip out of our body. It's almost as if we leave a really heavy garment behind, and now for the first time we see our potential. Also because this is really our primary state we are entering into. We're getting out of our exile state and we're entering into our primary home state. And that is the other thing. There is an attraction, there's an inner attraction which draws us forward. And that is the way I identified it, was a feeling of homecoming, you know. And this feeling of homecoming becomes stronger the higher our consciousness, the more our consciousness expands. So we feel better as we advance, you know, into higher levels. And this quite naturally expands from the Summerland. We are able to exponentially grow then, you know. So we activate the heart chakras, the heart feeling, and that draws new circumstances to us, new people, new methods of learning, and so we gradually become more open to more opportunities, you know. And this advances our expansion of consciousness. And I noticed recently I commented on a video by what's his name? Swedenborg. You know, there's a website by Swedenborg, and I didn't really know much about Swedenborg. When I saw this video, I suddenly looked into Swedenborg, and Swedenborg talks about angels a lot, but he doesn't regard angels as different species from human. He sees angels as human beings who have simply transcended their limitations and expanded their consciousness. No, there are certain things, there are certain resistances which we have here, which we don't have there. So it's this aspect of resistance which generates a lot of energy, a lot of confrontation, a lot of conflict, It's basically the physical resistance which we seek out if we want to learn particularly hard lessons, which are not so easily learned or understood on the spiritual levels, because everything is more easily accomplishable. We have much better access to our subconscious on the spiritual level. For example, here when we have a problem, we have to really work at it. We have to work it out. We have to see a therapist, to work it out. On the astral level, if we have got a negative feeling, we can actually see the negative feeling in our environment. For example, we have, let's say, we have chosen the physical incarnation simply because it gives us more friction and it gives us more grit and more intensity of learning, So that is a very desirable place for a lot of people to go through. And it also the other thing is the more cosmic aspect of the physical level is that we are going the plan is, of what I understood, which I also described in the 10-minute moment, that our human species is going through a transformation, and we have to work together, we have to learn together to work out our evolution. And this evolution is aimed towards realizing awakening states of consciousness, which are the states of consciousness I spoke about earlier. And this will transport our species onto a new level of evolution. This may take a few thousand years, but we are, even in this century, we are going through quite dramatic evolutionary changes. So this is important also from our biological point of view, that the reason why we're sort of incarnated here, there's a bigger plan behind it all. As your consciousness expands, you get into a knowing field. I call it the knowing field, where you simply know certain things, and you don't even have to translate it into thoughts. There's certain awareness of how things are and what you have to do. There's an awareness of which is coming from, your higher self or your higher awareness. And some people, what you just expressed is very similar to my silent companion, and I would say there is a connection to the higher awareness. When I went to Scotland, my silent companion ceased, because during that episode I became my silent companion, I sort of I merged with my silent companion, and since then I don't have the silent companion anymore, because there is just not there anymore, and it's basically when we live in this dualistic type of consciousness, we still make a separation between us and the higher awareness, but once this separation stops, we are simply the best way I can describe it is it's like walking in a garden of Eden, let's say, and picking fruit and these fruits are sort of knowing. It's knowing. They give us a lot of wisdom. They give us a lot of nourishment, you know. So we're walking through a garden which has got no outside. It's our home turf. It feels like Sunday all the time, and we're picking fruits in this garden, and we live off this fruit, and the fruit is knowing, is a sense of knowingness. I have to confess, I don't try to get into an out-of-body experience. I'm not really even motivated to get into an out-of-body experience. The way things are now, that I'm just sort of responding to what's happening, you know. If I have an out-of-body experience now, it's usually very spontaneous, and it takes me to an area which is of some significance to me, you know. But I'm not really interested in having out-of-body experience. I'm too focused on being in the present moment, and the present moment dictates to me what needs to be done, what needs to be said, you know, what needs to be experienced. So, and for example, sometimes I go to the beach. We are very lucky, we live near the sea, and I sit on the groin there, and I just sort of naturally listen to the waves, you know, and then I close my eyes, and then the waves, the repetitive sound of the waves turns into a sound score, you know, and then I allow myself to let go and surrender, and that is a form of meditation, you know, to surrender, and that happens spontaneously. Meditation to me, it's basically being, and if you want to have a good technique of meditation, let's say your meditation consists of focusing on the light. Let's say an inner light. You focus on your third eye, and you visualize the light. The meditation for me would be not to focus on the light, but to feel what it is like to be the light. So instead of having the separation of focusing on the light, you see it from the position of the light. So what you're doing, it because you are the light, you're shining out into the world. So that's your meditation. If you meditate on a mantra, for example, let's say you have a mantra like the Om, instead of saying the word Om, you become the word Om. Okay, you're working from a point of unity, and you are you know, that is true meditation. And then it's very easy to surrender to this kind of meditation, you know, because you already are, you know, where you want to, what you want to meditate on. So basically, to me, meditation is being, you know, if you are, and you don't have any wants, any needs, you don't want to achieve anything, you don't want to get anything. To me, that is meditation, just to accept reality as it is. Yeah, first of all, I make a distinction. I think the Summerland is still sort of, we still have our ego, you know, even in the higher levels, you know, we still have the ego identification. There's only a little shift that we don't lose our individuality. We don't lose our persona, okay? There's no stage in the expansion of consciousness where we lose anything, okay? The way I see it, we gain things. We become more of who we are, not less. So So Maslow in the 50s called it self-actualization. The more we mature, the more we fulfill our potential, the more we become truly of who we are. Because you have to remember, we spent probably thousands of years in our previous history trying to get to the point where we are now. And there's a continuous growth, you know. And when we expand our consciousness to the point that we have this sort of unity awareness, that we recognize everything has got the same source or the same origin, we still recognize other people as who they are. You know, our parents, and they can be in a very, very high state of consciousness. They become more like they are, you know, but based on a level of love. The love aspect is a predominant aspect of their humanity, and this love aspect makes them who they really are, who they truly are. The other things which we sort of didn't like so much, they were usually the attribute of their ego. That falls away because the conflict no longer exists. We become more harmonized in our true self because it's love-driven, compassion-driven, and so we are on an expansive trajectory. The higher our consciousness rises, the more we unfold, the more we learn, the more we become who we really are. And that's the difference, you know. And the Summerland, I would say, there is still the astral level, the higher astral level. There are still ego aspects which we're working through. The ego aspects could be that we have got an ambition to become famous, for example. On the higher levels, fame is no longer an issue. We just radiate in our personality of who we really are, and we become naturally famous, if that's our destiny, if that was ever an issue in our lives, you know. So that's what I would like to say to that, you know. It's an expansion of consciousness, not a contraction. Yeah, the best way to explain this is we all have an astral body, okay? We are not aware of the astral body, but our astral body has its own environment, its own vibratory vibration frequency level. And the people who died, the friends and family who died, they are now fully inhabiting their astral body. And the way we communicate, which is a problem for us, but not a problem for them. They can interact with our astral body, but we may not be aware of it. You know, we may become aware of it when we are asleep and we dream about them. Okay, that may be the moment we are aware. But they haven't lost us at any one point. They can communicate with us or give us, you know, send us a loving energy at any point they wish or we wish. You know, or they can just leave us alone and go along their own merry way and just sort of, you know, like when the kids leave home, they want to be on their own, they want to live their own lives. Of course, that happens with people in this life. They go their separate ways, and also, you know, they may not be continuously you know, connected with us in this way. That could be quite limiting in some ways. You know, for example, when people just left somebody and they have such powerful, feel such powerful suffering of separation, at one stage that can also become a burden for people who left, because especially if this suffering is connected with this pain, this fear, this loneliness, that can become a little bit of a burden. So I would say the best thing is, if we are suffering from bereavement, to focus on our heart energy, and instead of feeling pain, feel love for that person. Okay? And that is the most positive way to also make a real connection to the person we have lost, because love vibrates on a much higher level than on the astral level. So we're actually helping the person, and they're helping us, because we're igniting a much higher energy which will help us overcome the bereavement, but also it will connect us to the person. You know, love will connect us, and if we feel, if we suffer from bereavement, if we activate love for the person, we will actually be much closer to them. I don't know whether it's necessary to follow a rigid system of meditation. I sometimes, my feeling is that meditation shouldn't be rigid. It should be something quite natural, like eating and drinking. You know, that's my take of it. And my meditation, which started off as a mantra, changed over the years because I listened to my silent companion. And I even received mantras through this channel, and I disregarded it at some stage. So my feeling is, with regard to unfolding, is to find the right level of relationship to your higher self. And what I find is, if you have a certain amount of devotion, you know, let's say people have got an advantage if they believe in God. If you believe in God, if you can harness a sense of devotion to this, or devotion towards life, or devotion to a love in your life, then the next stage would be to love. You know, love is another energizer which we can bring into our lives. It's another sort of form of meditation. And the third stage would be then the surrender. And then when we have these stages, we are much closer to realization than if we were following a rigid regime, you know, which is prescribed by somebody else. That's how I feel. But of course, there are lots of people who would disagree with me, because everybody is different, you know, and that's a beautiful thing. There are some Zen people who go through an incredibly rigid process. And that's fine, you know. And when I went to Mount Athos, these monks, they prayed for 8 hours a day, and they did it for years. And I would never be able to do that, but that was right for them. So we all have to find our own path, really.